Bona tarda a tothom, gràcies per venir. Passaré a anglès perquè la xerrada serà en anglès i és la meva llengua materna també. It's a great pleasure to introduce Edouard Machery to you. My name is Carl Hoefer, and I'm the director of the, scientific director now, of the Barcelona Institute of Analytic Philosophy. If there's anyone here who doesn't know what analytic philosophy is, don't worry, because you will have a good demonstration of what the method does in Edouard's talk. Edouard Machery studied at the University of Paris-Sorbonne and got his PhD in 2004. He was immediately hired by the best philosophy of science department in at least the United States and maybe the world, at the University of Pittsburgh, where he has been a professor ever since. He rose very rapidly through the ranks to become associate professor with tenure and then full professor, and then he is now a distinguished university professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Pittsburgh. He is also the director of the Center for Philosophy of Science, which is an extremely important and famous center of research in philosophy of science that was founded by some of the great logical positivists of the 20th century. What was the year of founding?
I'm not really sure, 61 or 62, something
Yeah,
like that.
so it's been around a long time. For myself, I have known Edouard since 2009, I believe, when I, on the suggestion of my wife, Genevieve Marti, she told me that there was this brilliant young French person that I could ask to be on the committee of a newly formed journal, the European Journal of Philosophy of Science. And Edouard kindly joined us in that task for the first 4 years of the journal. Edouard is a philosopher of science in general, but also especially a philosopher of cognitive science. And he has written books on issues such as doing away with concepts. He's written another book on sorry, I'm looking at the title, Philosophy Within Its Proper Bounds. He's interested in the limitations and the methods of philosophy, and that has led him to do work in a new field called experimental philosophy, which applies the methods of research taken mostly from psychology and related social sciences, and applies them to learning about how people think and how people think about concepts, words, and so forth. He is an incredibly prolific writer, having written now 3 books. He'll be telling us tonight about the forthcoming third monograph, edited many others. He's the author of over 150 scientific papers. And so I think without going on, and I could go on for a long time about his merits, I'll give the floor to Edouard Machery.
Thanks, Carl, for this very kind introduction. So it was a pleasure to be back in Barcelona. I've been here many times, and whenever I come back, I'm delighted. It's one of my favorite places in the whole world, so I'm really happy to be here. As you can hear, I'm French. I've been in the US for more than 20 years, but still speak with a very clear French accent. It's relevant, I'm telling you that, in case you have a clarification question during the talk, I say something, you didn't quite get what I said, because my talk will be in English, feel free to stop me, and I'll be happy to say one more thing, so I try to explicate what I just said again. However, for substantial questions that are challenging what I'm saying, I suggest we leave them to the end of the talk. All right? Good. So what I want to be talking about today is whether or not we should trust science. And the question might seem utterly obvious, and the answer might seem obviously yes. And indeed, if you look at recent writings, that seems to be the common answer. Naomi Oreskes is one of the most famous historians of science alive. She's at Harvard, and she wrote this very short book, Why Trust Science?, arguing that science is eminently trustworthy and that we obviously ought to trust science. Furthermore, there is a small literature coming from psychology and sometimes sociology that tries to explain why weird people, strange people, might be skeptical of science in some ways. with books such as The Truth About Denial, Science Denial, and even worse, the deadly rise of anti-science. And it's viewed as something pathological and sometimes politically wrong to be questioning science. So much so that back in the early 2020s, during the COVID era, it became something of a political slogan in North America to express one's commitment to science, to express one's trust in science. And there is no doubt that science is the most amazing epistemic enterprise that humans have ever done. We've learned things through science that we would not have learned otherwise. We've learned, for example, that the DNA, Watson just died yesterday or 2 days ago, one of the discoverer of DNA. We learned that DNA, this molecule in every cell, is a basis that is for part of inheritance. We've learned, for example, that all living creatures, from plants to viruses to mammals, including human beings, share a common ancestor, right? There's only one tree of life that goes back to one origin. We've learned, for example, since the 18th century, we know all the major organs in the human body. That itself was an extraordinary epistemic achievement. We had to wait for the 17th, 18th century to know every single major organs in the human body. So we've learned an enormous amount of things about the world through science. And the point of this talk is not to demean science, it's not to contest the incredible amount of success in science. We've also have incredible practical applications of science. That man here is Jonas Salk, who in 1955 discovered the polio vaccine that has saved about 1.5 million lives of children and prevented about 20 million children from being paralyzed. I mention him because he did his work at the University of Pittsburgh, where I'm actually working. He's no doubt one of the great benefactors of humanity. And again, he did that through his scientific work. And that's a picture of explorer.
Bona tarda a tothom. Benvinguts i benvingudes en aquest homenatge a Josep Maria Eno de la Sarte, molt honorable president del Parlament de Catalunya, familiars i amics de Josep Maria Eno i socis i sòcies de l'Ateneu. Gràcies a tots per ser avui aquí i per acompanyar-nos en aquest reconeixement. Josep Maria Eno es va fer soci de l'Ateneu l'any 1980 per invitació de Josep Andreu i Abelló. Va ser un home molt vinculat a aquesta casa i es va inscriure a la secció de Ciències Morals i Polítiques. Va ser vocal de la Junta Directiva entre 1994 i 1997 sota la presidència d'Heribert Barrera i va pronunciar la conferència inaugural del curs 92-93 dedicada a Prat de la Riba. Al llarg dels anys va participar en més de 10 conferències. Al gener del 2012, sota la presidència de Francesc Cabana, va ser nomenat soci d'honor de l'Ateneu. Va ser un soci molt estimat, molt respectat, que va deixar una empremta profunda en la vida d'aquesta entitat. El 19 de novembre del 2015, pocs mesos després que ens deixés, l'Ateneu li va dedicar un homenatge que portava el títol de Josep Maria Eno de la Sarte, l'home, l'historiador i l'humanista. En Patrici.
All right, we're back on track. So as I was saying, science has been incredibly successful from a theoretical point of view and from a practical point of view. It has changed our lives. And I don't want to demean science here. However, what I will be arguing is that for large parts of ongoing science, trust is not a proper relation we should have toward the kind of science that's science in the making, the kind of research that science are actually doing. And if not trust, what then? And at the end of this talk, I will try to suggest another model for our relation to science. Right. So the first thing I should do is tell you a bit more what I mean by trust. Right? What does it mean to trust someone? What does it mean for that person to trust this person here? And maybe one way to start is to look at an example, a commonsensical example, to help us think through the relation of trust. So here's Amy. She's coming from the airport. She's at the airport in Barcelona. She's just landed. And here's her friend John. And Amy trusts John to pick her at the airport, right? It's a very simple situation. Two people, someone who trusts, a truster, someone who is trusted, a trustee, and a relation and an object of trust being picked up at the airport. All right, that's a very simple situation. We all have that in mind. Now, what does it mean for Amy to trust John to pick her up at the airport? According to me, it means that Amy is behaving and believing under one assumption. She's assuming that John will actually be at the airport. She's making the assumption that John will be successful at picking her up at the airport. And she's acting, behaving, and believing under this assumption. What does that really mean concretely? Well, here's what Amy doesn't do. She does not book an Uber. She does not go on her phone. She does not go to the taxi stand. Right? She does not look on the map, on Google Map, about how to go from the airport to her hotel in town. She does not look for the subway. What she does, rather, is she goes down, and then she goes to the place where passengers get picked up. So she's acting as if she's certain, so to speak, that John will be picking her up at the airport. So in my view, that's a paradigmatic example of what trust is. When someone, a truster, trusts someone else, a trustee, to do something, the truster, the first person, is acting and behaving, or is behaving and believing under the assumption that the trustee, the person who is trusted, will successfully do the action. Right? So Amy is acting and believing under the assumption that John will be successful at picking her up at the airport. Right? Is that clear as the notion of trust, what I mean by trust? Good. Now, in the context that interests us, we're looking about a specific action, not picking up someone at the airport. We're talking about saying things about the world. Scientists who tell us things about the world. Philosophers use the word assertion for this kind of speech act. Scientists make assertion when they tell us that the world is so and so, that all living creatures have a common ancestor, that DNA is in every cell the basis of inheritance. Right? So they give us information, so to speak, about the world. Right? They make assertion. So that's a specific action of interest. So what does it mean to trust science? It means that we, or scientists themselves, are acting and believing under the assumption that scientists are making successful assertions, that they are successful when they're asserting things. What does it mean to be successful when you are asserting some things? What does it mean to make a successful assertion? It's a complicated question in philosophy. There's a lot of debate about that. But right now I will just say it means that you have good reasons to say what you say. Right? You have some justification. All right, let's put all these ideas together. That's Feynman, one of the most famous physicists in the world. And Feynman, as you know, is very famous for his lectures. He was wonderful at exposing the most difficult physics. What does it mean to trust Feynman when Feynman tells us about physics? It means that we are behaving and forming our beliefs under the assumption that when Feynman tells us something about the world, he's got good reason for telling us the kind of things he says, right? He's not saying random things. It's based on experiments. It's based on a good theory. It's based on the data he's been collecting, on a good method, all right? So trusting science under my analysis is having this relation to science. Scientists tell us things about the world, and we're acting. For example, we take drugs. We do a lot of different things. We're believing, changing our beliefs, by making the assumption that when they tell us things, they really have good reasons, right? The things they're telling us, their assertions, are based on their research, on good quality evidence, on good theories. Right? That's what I take trust to be. Now, the next question is, when should we refrain from giving trust to someone? Right? When are we in a position to say, oh, I thought that science was trustworthy, but maybe it isn't? Right? So what are the reasons we might have, you and me, to suspend trust in science? Well, there are many such reasons. For example, we can learn that a scientist is a fraud or a fraudster that is making up his data. Then, of course, we are not going to be trusting that scientist. We might also learn that an area of science is very controversial, that scientists do not agree with one another, that there is no consensus, in which case we might not judge that we should trust the scientist, right? It's an area, the work is not settled. But here's another situation in which I think we learn that we should not trust an area of science. When we find out that in this area of science there are a lot of replication failures. So let me explain to you what that means. What's a replication? A replication is what scientists do when they find a first experiment that has been done by other scientists, that has been published, and they will do roughly the same experiment. Right? So you look at a scientific journal, at Science, at Nature, at Psychological Science, any journal, you take a study in it, you see what the scientists have done, and you will do roughly the same experiment. It's called a replication. Now, sometimes replications succeed, and you get the same result. Sometimes, and I will tell you very often, replications fail, and you get a very different result. That's why here, you have different flowers, right? You try to have the same result, you will do the same experiment, but you end up with a very different result. It's a replication failure. Now, replication failure happens for many reasons. It's a complicated reason, it's a complicated question. Why did a replication fail? But when you're in a situation where you find many replication failures, not just one, but really many replication failures, either by a scientist or by a group of scientists or in an area of science, you are in a situation that what we might call a replication crisis. And you should be suspecting that there was something wrong with the original results. You should be suspecting that the original scientific reports, they were not made on the basis of good reasons. Because if they had been made on the basis of good reasons, then very likely, when you had replicated the study, you would have found the same results. Right? The fact that with regularity you fail to find the same result suggests that the original finding, something was fishy with them. Something was fishy in the research that scientists conducted. Right? So you see the thought, you take an area of science, you look at what has been published, you redo the experiment, you see, oh, when I redo the experiment, I find different results. I have a replication failure. And you think, oh, there must have been something wrong with the original reports. Scientists probably did not have good reason to make the scientific report that they actually made. And if you find out that it's a very common situation in an area of science, then you have a good reason to suspend your trust with respect to this area of science. And if you find out that in much of science, when you do a replication, you find a different result, then you have a good reason to be refraining from trusting much of science. There's something broken in some parts of science. All right. Okay, where are we? I've told you what I mean by trust. I've told you also that in the context of science, to trust science is to listen to what scientists say and to be disposed to act and believe by assuming that they have good reasons for making their assertion, for making scientific reports. And on that basis, I've given you a reason for suspending trust. When you do a lot of replication and you find out that in some area of science, or maybe across many areas of science, when you redo the studies, you find different results, then you should be suspecting that the original reports were fishy in some interesting ways. Otherwise, you would have found the same thing. All right, that's where we are at this point. Now, the next question is, how well does science replicate? When you take scientific studies and redo them, do you find the same results? Think about what your answer would be to that question before I give you some information. Do you think, take an area of science you know some about, and imagine if I were to do 100 experiments recently published in that area of science, not experiment like 75 years ago, recently published experiment, how many of them would replicate? Put a number in your head. All right? Don't tell me, just anchor your thought to that number. All right, let's start with psychology. That's one of the most famous papers published over the last 15 years in science, published in 2015 in the journal Science by the Open Science Collaboration led by psychologist Brian Nosek at the University of Virginia. Now he's at the time I believe he was still at Harvard. So let me describe this graph for you. What you see on the y, so before describing the graph, let me describe the experiment. What Nosek did, and colleagues, is take 100 experiments published in 4 leading journals in psychology. So it shows them quasi-randomly, not fully randomly, but quasi-randomly. I can tell you more about the details, but it does not really matter. And they replicated these 100 experiments. So they just chose 100 experiments and they redid them to see whether they would find the same thing, as simple as it gets. What you see on the on the x-axis here, are the results of the 100 original experiments, the ones that were originally published. If it's green, as you see it means that the original experiment was reporting a positive result, a significant result, as scientists say. Right? Something was found that deserved publication. As you can see, pretty much all of them claim to report something noteworthy, claim to make a discovery, make a finding, except 3 of them. So 97 of the 100 reported a discovery. What you see on the y-axis, the ticks there, are the replication. Of the 100 replication, only 36 reported making a findings. 64 of them found nothing, which means that about 30% or 35%, only 35% of the replication were successful. About 2/3 of the replication failed. So you take randomly 100 experiments, you should be expecting 2/3 of them to fail. I hope you're shocked, because you should be. I mean, this is an incredible number. It just means takes 100 studies published in some of the best journals in psychology. You redo them, you should be expecting more than 1 out of 2. In fact, nearly 2 out of 3 to fail. Okay? And it's not just, there's a bit more to be said here, but I'll skip the details. Now you might think psychology is not quite a science, so okay, that's not so bad. You know, who cares about psychology, really? I'm a philosopher of psychology, so I care a lot about psychology. But that might be your reaction. But it's not just psychology. So what you see here is the same project, also led by Brian Nosek, but this time about oncology, the study of cancer. It's a study with animals. So it's really the first stage, it's research, the research part of the study of cancer. And it's not 100 studies, it's all the studies published over the last 10 years. So it's 36 studies. And how many of them do you think replicated successfully? What? Give me a percentage. 36%. Only 1 out of 3 replicated successfully. 2 studies about cancer. We're not talking about psychology. We're talking about one of the most important areas of research in the whole world. Billions of dollars have been invested in trying to understand the causes and find a solution for cancer. Most of the studies, when you replicate them, fail to replicate. And as you can see, you get very similar images, right? Most of the original findings report positive results. One exception is 1 out of 36. 2/3 of the replication report negative results. What you see here is a blowout of this small part of the graph. So that gets to be expanded here. And again, it's not just psychology, it's not just biomedicine. You find concerns about replication in other areas of science. So here is something that one of my colleagues at Pitt, Sergei Frolov, who is a physicist, has been spending a lot of time doing. There's something called Majorana fermion, which is a particle which is its own antiparticle. It's predicted to exist, but we don't have any evidence that it exists. Furthermore, it's very hard to provide the evidence. Require very technical. It's tabletop physics. So it's kind of things you can do in a lab. You don't need to have an accelerator to do it. It's important for economic purposes. It's supposed to play a role in quantum computing. So if we have evidence that it exists, it might help quantum computing. I don't know the detail because I'm not a physicist. In any case, in the second half of the 2010s, 3 papers were published either in Science or Nature, so the top journals in science, reporting evidence for the existence of Majorana particles. It turned out that none of these papers replicated when you try to replicate them. And so again, replication here just not limited to psychology. You find the same issue in biomedicine, you find the same issue in physics, maybe to a different degree, but you do find concern with replication. All right. I hope we're all on the same page. I've told you a concern that if in an area of science or many areas of science, when you replicate a study, you're likely not to find the same result. You should have concern about the original research. Something was wrong with it. It was not made based on good reason, and so you should not trust this area of science. And I've given you reason to believe. In the book, there's literally dozens of pages. I finished a book on the topic. There's dozens of pages reviewing the evidence. I'm just giving you some highlights here. All right? In some ways, we should have known that it was going to be the case. We should have known there was something fishy in science before doing these replication studies. Here's one reason. What you see here is drawn from a paper by Fanelli, and it looks at the number of positive papers, positive findings in science. It means you take an issue of a journal in psychology or in physics or in biology and look at how many articles are reporting a positive result, that they found something. Right? And what you can see is that scientists are all geniuses. They always find something. They never report finding nothing. So in psychology, 90% of the articles report a positive result. In economics, it's only 85. These economists are slackers. In biology or something like that, it's about 80. The lesson is psychologists, scientists always seem to find something. We know that should not be the case. Why do we know that should not be the case? Because of what? Sorry, because of what statisticians call power. So I won't spend too much time explaining what power is, but it is roughly, so if there is an effect to be found, if there is something to be found in the world, there's really something there. It's a probability that you're going to be finding it. It's a caricature, it's a simplification, but that's the idea, right? There's really something that's there to be found. When you do your experiment, what is the probability you're going to get it? Right? If it's 0.9, it means you're almost certain to find what there is to be found. If it's 0.5, then it's like throwing a coin when you do your experiment, whether or not you're likely to find it. If it's 0.2, then you'd better throw a coin rather than do your experiment to find the truth. All right? You get a sense what power is, roughly? Now, that's the power in psychology in 2014, and nothing has changed since the 1970s. Power in psychology is about 0.5, which means that instead of doing an experiment, throw a coin, you're as likely to get at the truth. It's much faster and much cheaper. You might think psychology, schmicology, who cares? Biomedicine, this article here reviews more than 100,000 studies. And under various assumptions, it's a complicated project, but under various assumptions, it reports that the power is below 0.1. It's 0.07 on average, which means that if there is something to be found, you've got less than 1 chance out of 10 to find it. Why do we pay that kind of research? I'm very serious. Why do we invest money to pay that kind of research? It's very problematic. Nonetheless, 90% of articles in psychology report a positive result. How is that possible? What do psychologists and scientists, what do scientists do when they have methods that are unable to get at the truth with reliability, but nonetheless, when they publish something, they always seem to be finding something? What do they do? Well, here's the kind of things they do. They fraud. They make up their data. What you have here is 3 famous fraudsters. Stapel, a Dutch fraudster who basically spent his life making up data until somehow he was found by his own students, by a colleague. Obokata, who is a Japanese biologist who claims that you can make stem cells out of ordinary cells and by just putting them in acid. Seems to be working according to her. She got a paper in Nature Science through that. Her advisor, who was innocent, committed suicide after it was revealed. It's Sasai. He was apparently not involved in the fraud. Schoen, a physicist, a German physicist who worked in Bell's laboratory in New Jersey in the USA, and who also spent 10 years faking up data and publishing in the top journals until he was stupid enough to publish the same image twice. And somehow people just caught up about him publishing the same image twice. But before that, no one got a sense he was actually faking up his data. So that's three very famous fraudsters. The question for you, and I don't have the answer, is are these exceptions, the bad apple hypothesis, just a few people, or is it rather the tip of the iceberg hypothesis, where we only catch a few fraudsters, but fraud is much more common in science than it is? My bet is that this is more like that. And I can tell you why. About 40% of men cheat on their spouses. About 70% of undergraduates cheat during college. Between 30 and 60% of taxpayers cheat when they're paying their taxes. Why do you think scientists are any different? I don't think so. I think scientists are human beings. I think cheating is a very common aspect of our behavior, and I have no reason to think that scientists are any different than the rest of us. All right, but I don't think fraud is the main reason. I think fraud is real, fraud is more common than what people think it is. But I don't think that's the reason why so much of science failed to replicate. More important is what is known as questionable research practices, which is a family of things scientists do that increase the chance of getting something positive, making a finding, so to speak, but that really create only an illusion of a finding. That you're in a position to report some results, but really it's purely illusory. Here's, for example, what counts as a questionable research practices. You can drop some data points. You look at your data points, at your data set, you do an experiment, you collect some data, you look at your data set, and you're almost there. You almost have a positive result. You drop a few data points, and when you drop these annoying, pesky data points, somehow you get a positive result. That's a bad practice, right? You're basically choosing your data based on what you want to find. It's a questionable research practice. It allows you to have a positive result, despite the fact that it's purely illusory. How often do psychologists do that? What you have here is a summary of a dozen of surveys, self-report surveys, and as you can see, between 25 and 40% of psychologists report having engaged in dropping outliers. That's a lot. You know, one psychologist out of 4 voluntarily is willing to say that they've done it. Here's another one. It's called optional stopping. You look at your data, and if you're close to having a positive result, you collect a few more data. And then you look at your data. If you're close to getting a positive result, but you're not quite there, you collect a few more data until you get something that looks like a positive result. If you do that, you're sure at some point to get a positive finding. But of course, your positive finding will be illusory. You're just like taking advantage of chance, right? How often do psychologists engage in optional stopping? According to themselves, as you can see, anytime, depending on the survey, from 15% to 50%, quite often, right? And it's not just psychologists. You look at biologists and ecologists, you find very similar results in biology and ecology. You can find more evidence of questionable research practices if you look at what is known as the chrysalis effect. So the chrysalis, as you know, butterflies, before being beautiful butterflies, they were ugly caterpillars. No offense to caterpillar lovers among you, right? But that's the same thing for science. Before being a beautiful article in a scientific journal, they were ugly findings in dissertation. So what you can do, you can compare the results that are published in dissertation and see how they transformed when they get published into articles. And see, again, systematic questionable research practices, turning ambiguous, ambivalent, unclear results into very clear findings. And all of that's illusory. That's questionable research practices. And the last thing, I'll just skip it. Okay, so where are we now? I've told you a few minutes ago that much of science felt that, at least in some areas of science, there's a very high rate of unreplication, of replication failures. And I've given you some reason about why that is the case. Fraud is more common than what you think. Questionable research practices, which are not the same as fraud. They're not like intentionally manipulating the data. They're more things you do because you've been told it's okay to do. Right? But questionable research practices are very common in science, in many areas of science. And they allow scientists to have the illusion of finding things, despite the fact that they're only having an illusion of finding things. Science is, in some respect, broken. All right, good. Now, what I've told you so far is science at its frontier. It's ongoing science, science that gets published in the journals last week, last month, last year, right? It's a science that's in the making, so to speak. What about textbook science? What about science that's not in the making, that was in the making maybe 5 years ago, maybe a decade ago? Is that in better state than science in the making? As you can see by these pictures, the answer is not going to be super positive. It's going to be no. And the reason is because of something I've called zombie literature. So zombie literature is a set of findings, it's a findings that is supported by dozens and sometimes hundreds of articles. So you have dozens of articles using different methods, coming from different labs, that all seem to converge onto the same conclusion about the world. But we learn a few years after that this conclusion is false. So we have this literature, and because there are so many papers that seem to say the same thing, it moves from being the frontier of science to textbook science. If everyone agrees for so long, so many labs, so many scientists, surely that must be the case, and we should be reporting it as settled science in a textbook science. Let me give you a few examples. This is called power posing. It was discovered, not really discovered, because there's nothing to discover, but it was discovered in a famous paper by Machery, who was a psychology professor in the business school at Harvard back in the 2010s. And here's a power pose. I'm power posing for you. Wonder Woman is also power posing for you. So the thought is, when you are power posing, putting an assertive position in your body, you have a change in your hormone, and the change in your hormone is supposed to affect your willingness to take risks. You become more risk-seeking or less risk-averse depending on your body position. Nice idea, could be true, for all we know. And indeed, Machery reported a groundbreaking paper back in the 2010s or 2009, I don't remember exactly the date, providing evidence for power pose. And following her, dozens of papers provided further evidence for the reality of power pose. So it's not one paper, it's dozens of papers by different people using different methods, all of which claim that power pose is real. When you take an assertive position, you're more likely to engage in risky behavior, or less likely to be risk-averse. Notice, Cuddy was very quick to note that it was very socially important, because for women to be more willing to take risk means to be more assertive in a business context, for example, when you negotiate your salary. And as a result, she views that as a tool to reduce the salary gap between men and women during business negotiations, salary negotiations. Now, it turns out that there is no such thing as power pose. It's a purely made-up phenomenon. But nonetheless, we have dozens of papers that claim that power pose is a reality. It's not the only one. Willpower, another effect in psychology that says that when you are inhibiting a learned tendency to do something, it reduces your capacity to engage in effortful activities in the future. So if you have to control, just imagine there's a cookie and you really want to grab the cookie, but you refrain yourself from grabbing the cookie. So you exert some power over your own disposition to learn to grab the cookie. Then you are told to solve a difficult math puzzle or chess puzzle, and you will stop very quickly because you've expended all your energy onto the inhibition. Okay? Seems very plausible in some ways. Hundreds of papers. It's a funding by Baumeister in 1998. Hundreds of papers suggest that this phenomenon is real. Turns out we know since 2016 and 2021 that's not a real phenomenon. But nonetheless, hundreds of papers converge in providing evidence for this phenomenon. And again, it's not just psychology. Here's the most cited paper of 2023. It's a paper by Caspi looking at the interaction between gene and environment. A groundbreaking paper in science. It was named the paper of the year. It was like discussed everywhere for a whole year. It created its own literature providing further evidence for this interaction between gene and environment. We now know it's not a real phenomenon. So these are this zombie literature in textbook science, right? How often they are, how many there are, we don't really know. But I think that should give us pause about just saying textbook science, just fine. Even textbook science has its own issues. Yeah, I mean, all of that were in textbooks. They were taught. So I checked. All of them were in textbooks. They moved very quickly from frontier of science to being taught at the undergraduate level. Good. At this point, it's not. It would be very natural of you to just raise the following objection. Fine. There's a lot of mistakes in science. Science is complicated. Science is messy. It's okay. Edouard, don't panic, don't overventilate, don't hyperventilate. It's fine. Why? Because science self-corrects. So it's okay to have many mistakes if you're really good at finding your own mistakes. You know, I make mistakes all the time when I write because I'm not a great typist, but I'm really good at finding my own mistake when I read my own work. Okay, so I don't leave too many typos in my writing. So the fact that there are many mistakes in itself is not so much an issue if science is good at self-correcting, right? And indeed, it's a very common idea in science. So here's Marcia McNutt. You might not know her. She's a geophysicist. She's American. She's a very important scientist. She was the editor of Science for nearly a decade. So basically, she was controlling the main journal in scientific publication for a decade. She also was a president of the National Academy of Science, which is, as you probably know, the main academy for scientists in the US, so an extremely important institution for the social organization of science. She's a woman that has an extraordinary amount of power. And she says, look, it's fine. Science has always been self-correcting. So it's okay if there are mistakes. Science is good at finding its own mistakes and correcting. And I want to say, yes, to some extent, science does sometimes self-correct. I've given you example, right? Power pose, example of self-correction. Ego depletion, example of self-correction. Gene cross-environment interaction, self-correction. So science does self-correct. I don't want to deny that. However, I want to say it's very unreliable at doing it. Here are some reasons to believe it's unreliable. How can it self-correct? By which mechanism? The most obvious candidate for self-correction would be doing replication. Right? You take a study that has been published, you replicate it, and you find out whether it's the same result. With a very efficient way to detect mistakes in science. Now, it turns out that replication are extremely rare in science. So in psychology, you had a grand total of 32 replication. Less than 0.03% of articles published in psychology are replication. In ecology, you have less than 0.02% of articles published in ecology are replication. And the same is true in economics. Basically, scientists never, ever, ever replicate the work done by others. They just don't do that. And for obvious reasons, that's not how you make your career. You don't do your career by checking the work others have done. You do your career by finding new things. So replication is undervalued in science. And as a result, the main tool for finding out mistakes is just not deployed by scientists. Things might be changing, hopefully, we'll see in the future. Now, scientists are very well known for being extremely critical. I don't know whether you've sat ever in a journal club. Some of you might be scientists. So many scientists have journal clubs where on a weekly basis they read articles written by other scientists. And if you've ever done that, you realize how acerbic and critical they can be. Like they trash pretty much every single paper they read. Right? They're really, 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 really acerbic individual. Nothing is good enough for a scientist. But that's the issue, you see. If nothing is good enough, if you're critical about everything, you're not quite in a position to distinguish the kind of things we should be trusting, the possible mistakes that are due to bad science, from the kind of things that actually we should not be trusting, right? You're just basically putting everything in a single lump, right? So journal clubs aren't just a good way to identify unreliable science. And the last thing is that scientists are happy not to worry about that, both at the individual level and institutional level. So what you see here are a citation analysis of the 100 article I mentioned earlier. You know, I told you about the open science collaboration study, about the 100 articles in psychology that were replicated. What happened to the citation of the 64 that were not replicated in comparison to the ones that were successfully replicated? As you can see, made no difference whatsoever. Both types of articles were cited at the same rate, which means that the replication failure had no impact on the influence of this article in the broader science. Scientists just don't care. And it's not just scientists. Institutions not only don't care, institutions are incentivized to not to care. Because it's very bad to say that one of yours turned out to have been a fraudster, to have done bad science. Journals make it very hard to withdraw papers. There's an ongoing case in BEM, British Journal of Medicine, BGM, where a paper that's obviously fraudulent and has been known for now months to be fraudulent has not yet been retracted, despite the fact that everyone agrees it's a fraudulent paper, and so on and so forth. So institutions are extremely unlikely to engage in the self-correction behavior for obviously incentive reason. So we're in a situation where we are told that science is efficiently self-corrective, but I think the evidence suggests it just isn't. Science just is not good at correcting itself. All right, we're nearing the end of the talk. I hope at this point you're quite all depressed. That's part of the project. It's really to switch our take on the nature of science, to switch of the way we view science. You know, science is incredible, but we should also acknowledge its intrinsic difficulty, how difficult it is to do well. So I started with the idea about what trust requires in the context of science. When Feynman tells us something about the world, to trust Feynman is to act and believe as if Feynman had good reason for telling us what he tells us, okay? Then I've told you, well, when in a field or in many fields of science, we find that there are many, many replication failures, then we should suspect there was something wrong with the original science, that scientists did not have good reason for their assertion, for their empirical report. And I've provided you with reason to believe that replication failures are actually quite substantial in many areas of science. Where does this leave us? This leaves us to the attitude we should have, which is, at least for ongoing science, on my view, we should be agnostic. We should suspend judgment. We should say, look, is that true that blah, blah, blah? Well, I do not know, but I'm not going to deny it either. I'm going to leave it an open question. Why? Because for science to settle, it takes a huge amount of time. It takes sometimes decades. And I think for much of the ongoing science, we should not be in a position to either endorse or reject. The right attitude toward much of what science tells us about the world is one of suspension of judgment, one of agnosticism. That's the conclusion I want to press on you. So that's one of my favorite scientists, someone I really love and admire. She's Liz Pelkey. She's one of the great developmental psychologists of the 20th century. She's actually at my center here giving a lecture. I might have taken the picture. And I really admire Spelke. The point is not to demean her. She's a wonderful scientist. But when Spelke tells me about what babies know, I think the right attitude is to suspend judgment. It's not to deny what she asserts. It's not to assert it. It's to take it, what she says, and just let time pass, let a few decades pass until somehow science gets it sorted. So that's the attitude. Notice This is a very common attitude we have toward much of toward much of the world. So let's suppose you're watching this network, you're American, and you have the bad fortune to be watching this horrible network, Fox News. I won't be allowed to go back in the US, but that's okay. I'll stay here. So I don't know about how many of you know Fox News. Fox News is the extreme right, Trumpist network. Not my taste, but you know, political diversity is very important. But let's suppose you're watching Fox News, and let's suppose, or you know, if you prefer MSNBC, which is the leftist version of Fox News, so that to be a offender of everyone, okay? So let's suppose you're watching a network, and you find out that often what this network tells you isn't an accurate representation of the world. Right? They tell you inflation is down, while inflation is up. They tell you unemployment is down, while unemployment is up. And again, you get evidence that their reports are not correct. What would be your attitude? Well, you get second-order evidence that what they tell you about the world isn't accurate. The right attitude is that you would stop believing them. At the very least, you would suspend judgment. They might be true, so you don't know. Maybe what they're saying is true, but you've got enough reason not to endorse what they're saying. So you're in a state of agnosticism. Right? And I think that should be a very similar attitude toward much of science. Notice the agnosticism I'm presenting is not science denialism. Science denialism are people who say what scientists say is wrong, and that's a product of a conspiracy. I'm not saying that at all. I actually think that science has been the most incredible epistemic project of humanity, and with enough time, decades, we might be able to get a more settled view of the world. So I'm not denying science as a project. I'm recommending that for ongoing science, we should suspend judgment about what it says, right? And for textbook science, we should take it with a grain of salt. That's what I want to be saying. And notice what I just said, right? So for the focus is more on ongoing frontier science. When it comes to settled science, I do not want to challenge it, right? Nothing I've said here is meant to be a challenge of, you know, textbook, old, 70-year-old, 100-year-old science that has been tested again and again, that's supported by a very robust body of evidence, and so on and so forth. Right? So that's really the focus of my agnosticism. Okay. All right, I'm almost done. The last thing I need to tell you about is action. I don't know how many of you are philosophers, but I have given you earlier a picture of Prou, the ancient philosopher who was a skeptic, meaning that his view was that you should never assert anything about the world, or you should never deny anything about the world, because you're never in a position to know anything about the world. So he was saying, no, I don't know that. No, I don't know it's contrary either. I don't know anything. In fact, maybe I should not talk. Now, a very old objection against this form of skepticism is action. Because of course, when you act, and you must act, you seem to be taking on things about the world, right? Often action seems to be based on what you believe. So it seems to be based on your commitment, right? It's a very old philosophical objection to skepticism. My agnosticism about science agnosticism, has a very similar issue. What should we do for global warming? Let's suppose I want to suspend judgment about global warming. I want to say, well, I'm not going to assert it, I'm not going to deny it, but not acting is not the same. Not acting is in some way acting. It's taking a specific course of action, right? So not stopping, not buying a green car and keeping driving a regular car is in effect taking a specific course of action. The same is true for vaccination. Not taking a vaccine is in effect acting in a specific way. There is no middle ground, right? So for the problem of action, I seem to be compelled to act one way or the other. And as a result, it's hard to see how the agnostic can actually really stand in a pure situation of agnostic. The agnostic always seems to be pressed to act based on what science says. So what is the agnostic supposed to say about, should I get a colonoscopy? I'm 50. 50 in the US is the age where you get a colonoscopy. Should I get one? Anyway, very concrete problem for me, as you can see. Should I get my COVID vaccine this year? No, I have to decide. I have to decide about this question. I can't just say, I'll suspend judgment. Okay? Okay. How do I think about this question? It's a very difficult question, but let me try to tell you a bit how I think about this question. And the best way to introduce, I tell you about baseball. I don't know about how many of you are Americans. One. Okay, two. Three. Oh, a few. All right. I'm French. I didn't grow up with baseball. I love to go to the stadium to eat fries and drink beer, which is really like a lovely evening. In Pittsburgh, the stadium is on the river. It's beautiful, amazing. It's really beautiful place. I don't really enjoy the game. Mostly because I was not raised with baseball. And the reason I don't enjoy the game is because the main action, as you know, is hitting the ball, right? And as you know, if you've ever watched a game of baseball, it's very, 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 very hard to hit the ball because the pitchers throw the ball at extraordinary speed with extraordinary trajectories. And when you're a hitter, you're more likely to hit the ball, to fail to hit the ball than not. So if you look at the average hit rate, it's 0.25, meaning that less than 3 times out of 10 is a hitter able to hit the ball. It's incredible. I mean, 7 times out of 10, the hitter fails to hit the ball. That's the best hitter in the history of baseball. His name is Tony Gwynn. I had my cheat sheet on my hand. Tony Gwynn, who's managed to, over a whole year, hit the ball 4 times out of 10, which is really remarkable, much higher than anyone else since then. But nonetheless, if you're a manager, you have to compose a team. So you know in advance that everyone on your team is more likely than not to fail to hit the ball. So you can't trust them that they're going to hit the ball. Because you know, at best, on average, they'll do it 1 time out of 4. If they're geniuses, 1 time out of 3. So you know in advance that they're unlikely to hit the ball. So you don't trust them to hit the ball. It would be silly. If you have to bet, you would bet against them hitting the ball on any given occasion. But nonetheless, you have to choose them. And what you do is a relation I call relying on them. You don't trust them, you rely on them. What do I mean by relying? I mean you are taking for granted that they have at least the capacity to hit the ball. It's at least within their reach to hit the ball. Not necessarily in a reliable manner, not necessarily very often, but that's something they can do. The manager would not rely on me because 100 miles per hour, I would never, ever, ever hit the ball. It just would be impossible for me to hit the ball. And they have the good intention, they have a good will, they're trying to hit the ball. So they have these 2 things, the capacity and the intention. So what you're assuming, what the manager is assuming, is that the baseball player has the capacity to do something and is willing to do it. And relying on someone is is acting and believing under the assumption that the person you're relying on has this capacity. So the manager is acting, namely choosing the player, under the assumption that they have the capacity and willingness to hit the ball. And I think that's the same true for communication. Let's suppose you're hiking in the Pyrenees, a bit north from here, between my country and your country, and you're lost. And then you see this random dude that tells you, maybe this way, I'm not so sure, I'm kind of lost myself. But that's the best information you have. Now, you're not going to trust that person. The random dude told you they're lost themselves. They're definitely not a trustworthy individual by any means, right? But you're still going to rely on them because that's the best thing you have, exactly as a manager, the best thing the manager has as the players in his team, right? So you can rely on people that you can't trust. In fact, we do that all the time. In much of our life, we rely on individuals for which we can't have the right trust relation. And what I want to say is that reliance is what explains why we can act on science, even ongoing science, despite the fact that we don't trust it. right? I don't particularly trust much of what's going on in science, ongoing science. In fact, I've argued that we should not trust it, and I'm trying to be consistent, so I don't trust it. But I often rely on it, and I rely on it when I have reason to believe that the scientists are competent, that is could get it right. I don't know whether they're likely to get it right, but they could get it right. They've done some experiments, they've collected data. So for all I know, they might have gotten it right. And they seem to be honest people. They're not fraudsters. Right? In that situation, I rely on them. So that's, should I get vaccinated? All right. Now, I'm not vaccinated for COVID this year. Nor was I last year. If I trust science, I will form the belief, based on the recommendation of the World Health Organization, that vaccination will very likely result in a lower likelihood of getting contaminated by COVID, of getting COVID. And I know, based on my own past experience, that if I get COVID vaccine, I spend 1 or 2 days in bed, because whenever I got vaccinated in the past, I've been sick for 1 or 2 days, and I don't like it. If I just rely on the World Health Organization, instead of trusting it, I will not believe that it will reduce the likelihood of getting sick, because I only assume that the doctors have the competence and are good intention, but that doesn't mean they're getting it right at all. No more than the baseball player. You know, the baseball player, I can rely on them, but I don't trust them. I believe they're more likely to be wrong than right, to miss the ball rather than get it. So the thing is that I will believe that it might reduce the likelihood of getting COVID. So if I trust it, I definitively will get vaccinated. If I rely on it, well, it depends on how I'm going to be weighing a day in bed and just the possibility of getting better. For me, but that's a matter of individual judgment, so it's not a recommendation to you, it's a matter of individual judgment, also your age and a lot of different factors. But for me, a day in bed adult is definitively not worth the mere possibility of not getting COVID. So last year and this year, I didn't get vaccinated and will not get vaccinated this year again. All right, so that's how reliance works in practice. Let me conclude. So what I've told you is that I want really, in a way, to conclude, to embrace the motto of the Royal Society. Nullius in verbia. Trust no one at their word. Take no. That was the original idea behind science. It was a call against trust, a call for organized skepticism in science, at the core of science. And I think that idea has been lost. I think the idea that what's fundamental for science is actually a skeptical look on what other scientists are doing. This idea has been replaced by a great practice of trust ongoing the social organization of science. And in one way to think about what I've been trying to do in this lecture and what I'm trying to do in the book is to call for more skepticism within science and with respect to us, lay people, in relation to science. Science is extremely complicated. Science, ongoing science is extremely messy, is extremely uncertain. And I think we should never forget the uncertainty of science. And I'll leave you at that. Can I answer the first question first? So it depends. Indeed, in some scientific fields, there is actually an institutionalized practice of replication. So particle physics, for example, the kind of data you get at CERN. So data are usually divided into 2 groups, into 2 data sets, and each data set is a replication of the other data set. So there are fields where replication is built into the process. Not in every field, however. Not in every part of physics I've mentioned earlier the search for Majorana particles. So it's not hard science versus soft science. It's some areas of science have a culture of replication, other areas of science don't. Why? It's an interesting question. Why? But not all areas of science do replication. I should also say that replication by the same lab is far from being enough, because if there's a bad practice that explains why you find the data in the first place, the second time you're going to have the same bad practice, and that might lead you to have the same result twice, despite the fact that it's all an illusion. So what you want is replication, ideally by other labs. No, I think that's something I think we should absolutely push against this idea. It used to be a very common view in science, and it is still in some quarters of science. I think failure to find something is extremely informative. It tells you that you expected to find something about the world, so you had a prediction based on your theory, and somehow that did not show up. Well, it does tell you maybe your theory was in some interesting way mistaken about making that prediction. Yeah, but so then you should be reporting failure to find things. You should always, except when the failure to find things is due to a bad experiment, which happens sometimes, of course. But if the experiment is good and you didn't find anything, you should be reported that you didn't find anything because you expected to find something. Does that make sense? Well, yes, you want to report that because you want other scientists to be aware of your failure. Science is not an individual practice. Science is a collective project. So you want the whole scientific community. That's the reason why we publish in science. You want the whole scientific community to know what you've done, so that they don't do it again, for example. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, it's a complicated question. So biomedicine, of course, which is your focus right here, is involve many different stakes. It involves incredible commercial stakes. In the case of the vaccine against COVID, the COVID vaccine, both the two companies, Pfizer and what's the name of the Moderna, made an extraordinary amount of money through the vaccine, and Moderna in particular, which became a powerhouse through COVID. Is actually Yeah, that's right. And it is now actually in dire shape nowadays. I read something about that recently. So it's a very complicated relation where the interests are both economic, politics, a situation of massive uncertainty. So what I think is the case is during COVID, with respect to COVID vaccine, so science was oversold and and misrepresented. So I think it is clear that the COVID vaccine saved lives overall, as there's no doubt about that, millions of lives. On the other hand, it did not do what it was often advertised to do, and as you mentioned it earlier. So there was a lot of things that were misrepresented in the process of selling a policy by governments that should have known better. Now, it's a complicated place to be. Here I'm in part a skeptic. I also want to put my hat and imagine myself as a policy maker in face of a situation that happened once every century, where you have an incredible, new, poorly understood virus, that has happened in 1999 with the flu. It happened, in 2020. What's that? It's possible, but that's irrelevant. The virus still is there. So I agree with you that the science was misrepresented. I'm not sure I agree with you about the skepticism about some of the possible some of the good effects of the virus. I think it has saved lives. The vaccine, sorry. Right. You all got it. I've been talking for 1 hour. I'm getting a little bit tired. I also, and I do think there was mistaken social policies that were imposed that were actually not justified by science. So I think we agree on that. I also want to acknowledge the difficulty that politicians were at the time, given an unprecedented political situation. I think many mistakes were made. I'm not quite sure exactly how. It was a very hard situation to deal for politicians. I think it's part of the humility of this project. Also, should mean that we should acknowledge that people make a lot of mistakes, are not in a situation of massive uncertainty, and make decisions knowing very, very little. And I think that maybe lead me to give them some slack. Anyway, that would be the kind of thing. Well, we can talk after. Yeah. Good.
To be specific, is there any difference between trusting and relying 100%? And to put into context, some people tell me you don't have to trust artificial intelligence, just rely on it, and I wonder what's the difference.
Good. It's partly a terminological question. So on my view, yes. We spent 2 hours this morning with some of the people here talking exactly about that question. So it's no, it's a great question. It's exactly right. It's not quite settled. So on my view, yes. What's the difference? That you're making a different assumption about the person you trust versus the person you rely on, right? When you're trusting someone, you're just assuming they are getting it right. When you're trusting John to pick you up at the airport, you're just assuming John will be there. And you're acting under this assumption, right? You're not booking an Uber. You're just going to the place where you're going to be picked up. Relying does not work this way, right? Relying, you're just not assuming that the agent will be successful at doing the action. You're just assuming that he could do it, he has some capacity to do it, and he's trying to do it. But that's going to lead you to very different types of behavior, right? If you assume that, yeah, John is able to pick me up and is willing to do it, maybe I'll look nonetheless on my Google map about how to go from the airport to my hotel, just in case he does not do it. So I think that's a categorical distinction that manifests itself in different behavior. So it's not a matter of degree, contrary to what some people insist. It's not a matter of degree as I understand it. But that's a great question. I think this is exactly a good question to ask. Thanks. Good. I hope that's shocking. Good. I love danger. I spend my life, so you know. No, again, this is not what I'm saying. First, there's no such thing as gravity theory. There's, you know, that does not exist. You know, you have you know, special relativity. You have general relativity, which are theory of gravity. But in any case, this is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is settled science. You can trust it as much as you want, and you can believe it. Nothing I've said challenges that. Well, this is not true. Obviously, surely you believe that all creatures have a common origin, don't you? I'll leave it at that. Thanks. Good. Excellent question. Both questions are very good. So I have a whole chapter on peer review in the book. Peer review is an utter failure. So when you examine, so as you probably know, often articles get sent to 2 or 3 or more reviewers, right? And then you can compare the recommendations about the same paper. And what you see is that they very rarely concur with one another. The rate of agreement among reviewers is better than chance. It's not purely random, but there's barely information in the reviewing process. So reviewing is not a reliable way for sorting good and bad science. I think this is pretty clear, except for appalling science. So very bad science, reviewers tend to agree. So if you send a very bad paper, reviewers are going to agree it's a very bad paper. But beyond this threshold, reviewing really does not help, does not provide much information about the quality of the science. So it's, in fact, so much so that I've come to the view that at least for some scientific activities, namely funding, we should do it randomly. We should stop reviewing papers. We should have a minimal review for quality, so that the very bad things get ejected, and everything else we choose a scientific project randomly. I should also say peer reviewing costs a fortune in terms of hours that scientists spend on peer reviewing. About 5 billion a year is, if you price the amount of time we scientists and we people in the humanities spend reviewing, it's an extremely expensive enterprise for an output that's extremely poor. So I think peer reviewing is a failure. It's a recent invention as a practice. It was developed really in the second half of the 20th century. So it's a very recent aspect of the social organization of science. I think we need to rethink it. And the future is really quite open about what's going to be replacing it. But I think people are coming to the view that it's not doing what it's meant to be doing. That's a great question. Editors, they're clearly responsible. If you send your paper to Science and Nature, they only want to have flashy positive results that are going to get into the New York Times on Tuesday. Tuesday, that's when the New York Times publishes its science page, and that's what their aim is, to get scientific results that get them into the New York Times. And this is the editor's choice. So editors are really quite responsible for what their journals do. I'm encouraged by a new crop of editors that is taking science reform very seriously. So Psychological Science, which is one of the leading journals in psychology, is edited by Simin Vazir, who is a leading science reformer. So she took over the journal 2 years ago, and she's trying to change it and change the practices. So, there's some good signs that maybe science might actually transform itself. We'll see whether it works, but I think editors have a clear responsibility for all of that. Yeah. Right. I agree. I agree. There's actually some empirical evidence suggested that it does improve the quality of the work. So I think that's right. It's very time consuming. So yeah, yeah. Good, so that's a role of incentives in explaining some of the issues I've talked about. So I think incentives are part of the picture, but also worries are not the whole story. So, I'm a strong believer in the role of scientific cultures. So practices we inherit from our mentors, from the people we admire. So it's not just a matter of incentives. I think there must be part of the stories. But I think there's also just practices that people pick up around them. So for example, I also do a lot of science in addition to being a philosopher. And when I was learning my behavioral science a long time ago, it was very common to drop outliers. And no one thought it was wrong. It was just, you've got a few outliers, just drop them. They're probably mistaken point anyway. And it was just taught as a matter of course. And it was not so that you were cheating. It was not so that you were biasing your data. It was just, that's what you do. They're far away from the mean. Surely they're wrong. Surely they're, and so it's not necessarily the incentives here. It was just the kind of things we were taught at the time. So I think it's a matter of culture and incentives together. Yeah. Uh-huh. Right. Good. American Economic Review. That's right. no, it's fine. So. So I think I agree with that. I should also say about scientific reform that I want to be quite pragmatic. We should try things and try to measure their impact and see what works and see what doesn't work. We should not be dogmatic. So I put a plug for randomization as a way of funding. You just want to see what works. It's actually being tested in Switzerland right now and in the UK. We'll see whether the science that's done is worse than when you don't have randomization. Let's test and let's see. I think I think science is a complicated beast. We need to try a lot of different things and see. Implementation is very complicated always. You start with good intention and then of course you end up with terrible side effects you hadn't been expecting. So I want to be extremely pragmatic in terms of science reform. I think we should try a lot of things, see what, and it might vary from field to field. I think your point is very well taken, that what might work for biomedical sciences might not work in economics and vice versa. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention.